The crisp December air in northern Minnesota bit hard, a familiar sting to Olaf Henriksen. It was 1888, and the land was already blanketed in white, promising a long, cold winter ahead. Olaf, a man whose hands knew the feel of wood and the bite of a shipwright's tools, stood gazing at his small log cabin. It was sturdy enough, built with his own strong back and the help of a few neighbors, but it was just that, enough. For a man who had felt the icy spray of the Norwegian sea and understood the fierce power of nature, enough rarely meant truly comfortable. He'd spent countless evenings by the flickering light of his fireplace, sketching ideas on scraps of birch bark. Now, in the fading light of a cold afternoon, those sketches were about to become real. Olaf planned something unusual, something that made his neighbors scratch their heads and whisper behind his back. He was going to build a second house, a bigger shell, right around his existing cabin. This wasn't an easy task, especially with winter already setting in. But Olaf was a man of quiet determination. He began by marking out the foundation lines in the snow, carefully measuring the distance from his cabin walls. He wanted a good, wide space, a gap that would be his secret weapon against the brutal Minnesota chill. He started felling trees, his axe ringing through the frosty air, each strike a testament to his resolve. He dragged the heavy logs, one by one, back to his property, piling them neatly. His nearest neighbor, old Sven, often stopped by, leaning on the fence with a bewildered look. "Olaf, my friend," Sven would call out, his breath misting in the cold. "Are you building a palace for a king? Or perhaps two houses for one man?" He'd chuckle, a puff of white smoke escaping his lips. Others were less kind. Their comments carried on the wind as Olaf worked. "Wasteful," they'd mutter. "Foolish." They thought he was simply adding more work to his already busy life, building something unnecessary when a perfectly good cabin already stood. But Olaf just smiled to himself, a knowing glint in his blue eyes. He kept to his task, laying the first timbers for the new outer walls. He knew what he was doing, and he knew it would make all the difference when the true fury of winter arrived. Each nail hammered, each log notched into place, was a step towards a warmth and comfort his neighbors couldn't yet imagine. He was building more than just walls. He was building shield. The sounds of Olaf's hammer and saw echoed through the frozen woods, a steady rhythm against the quiet hiss of falling snow. Every day, the outer shell of his new house grew taller, surrounding his little log cabin. But with each new log he put in place, the whispers from his neighbors grew louder, like a cold wind carrying their doubt. They couldn't understand why he was doing this. Why build another house when one was already standing? "Look at him," Lars, a big, burly farmer, grumbled to his wife, Helga, as they passed Olaf's place on their sled. "He's wasting good timber that we could build a barn or fix a roof, not stand around an already good house." Helga nodded, pulling her shawl tighter. The idea seemed just plain odd. Young Eric, who usually admired Olaf's strength, stopped by one afternoon. He watched Olaf carefully fit a new log, then asked, "Mr. Henriksen, why are you building another wall outside your wall? Is your first house broken?" Olaf just chuckled softly, a twinkle in his eye, and said, "Not broken, young Eric. Just getting ready for something even better." But Eric still looked puzzled. The men at the general store often talked about Olaf. "He must have too much time on his hands," someone would say, shaking their head. "Or perhaps the cold has made him a bit addled," another would joke, making everyone laugh. They thought it was a big joke, this idea of a house around a house. They saw it as a huge waste of effort, energy, and precious wood. Each log Olaf lifted was heavy. Each swing of his axe took strength, and the community saw these efforts as pointless. They believed that a good, thick log cabin with a roaring fire inside was all anyone needed to survive a Minnesota winter. They'd been doing it for years, their fathers and grandfathers before them. Why change what worked? Olaf's project seemed to challenge their old ways, and they didn't like it. They had their own chores, their own struggles, and seeing Olaf spend so much effort on what they thought was a silly idea just didn't make sense. But Olaf didn't let their words stop him. He kept working, his mind clear, his purpose firm. He heard their jokes and their worried sighs, but he simply dipped his head and continued. He knew something they didn't, a secret about how to truly beat the cold, a secret he had learned from ships and the sea. The ridicule was just like the cold wind. It blew around him, but couldn't stop him from building his shield. He knew his efforts weren't wasted, not one bit. He was building for a future, for a comfort that would soon surprise them all. While his neighbors saw only a strange, wasteful project, Olaf Henriksen saw something else entirely. He wasn't just building two houses. He was applying a very smart idea he knew from his old life. Before coming to Minnesota, Olaf had spent many years in Norway, working as a shipbuilder. He knew all about how to make strong, safe ships that could stand up to the wildest oceans and the coldest northern waters. In shipbuilding, every part had a purpose, especially when dealing with the elements. Olaf had learned that air, when trapped, could be a wonderful thing. It could keep things warm or cool, and it could protect. He remembered how double hulls were sometimes built on special boats, with a space between the inner and outer layers. This space, filled with air, helped keep the ship from sinking if the outer hull was damaged, but also did something else very important. It helped keep the cargo and crew safe from the biting cold of the sea. This knowledge sparked an idea in Olaf's mind when he first felt the fierce chill of a Minnesota winter. He thought, if an air gap can protect a ship on the frozen sea, why can't it protect a house on frozen land? He called his idea air gap insulation. It wasn't a fancy name, but it described exactly what he was doing. He was creating a big, quiet space of air between his old cabin and the new outer walls. He pictured the cold winds howling outside. He imagined them hitting the outer wall of his new structure. But instead of the cold air pushing straight through to his living space, it would hit the first wall, and then it would have to deal with a layer of trapped air. This air, he knew, wouldn't let the cold pass through easily. It would act like a soft, invisible blanket, holding the warmth inside his cabin and keeping the biting cold out. Olaf didn't talk much about his special idea. He just worked, his movements practiced, and sure, he knew his neighbors didn't understand. They saw logs and nails. He saw science and warmth. He saw a way to take the lessons from the sea and bring them to the snowy plains, turning what seemed like a silly project into a clever solution for staying cozy through the long, harsh winters. He was building smarter, not just bigger, using an old secret in a brand new way. The true magic of Olaf's plan wasn't just in building a second wall, but in the exact distance he chose for it. With his long measuring tape, he made sure there was a precise 3-foot gap between his sturdy old log cabin and the new outer structure. This wasn't a random guess. It was a carefully thought-out measurement, crucial to his air gap insulation idea. Imagine stepping from the warmth of a room into a small, enclosed porch, and then opening another door to the outside. That's a bit like what Olaf was creating. The 3-foot space was like a hidden hallway all around his house. It was wide enough for him to walk through, to inspect the inner and outer walls, and even to store things. But its main job was to hold a thick layer of still air. He worked meticulously, checking each log, each corner. The outer walls rose steadily, forming a strong, protective shell. When he finished the outer framework, the original cabin looked like a smaller house nestled inside a bigger one, separated by that important 3-foot buffer. Sunlight could still filter in through the windows of his inner cabin, but now it would first pass through the outer shell and then across the quiet air-filled space. This gap was like a secret passage for the elements. The howling wind would hit the outer wall and be stopped. The biting cold, trying to push through, would find itself stuck in that 3-foot air cushion, unable to easily reach the inner cabin. And any little bit of warmth trying to escape from Olaf's fire would also find it hard to pass through that same cushion of air, staying trapped inside where it belonged. Olaf carefully planned for small openings near the top and bottom of this space, just big enough to allow a tiny bit of air to move very slowly, preventing moisture from building up, but not so much that the precious insulating effect would be lost. He even built a small, simple door into the outer wall, so he could enter this gap and walk around his inner cabin if needed. It was like having a secret, sheltered walkway all around his home. His neighbors watched him build this wide space, puzzled. Why so much room? they wondered. He could have made his inner house bigger or built a smaller, simpler outer wall. But Olaf knew better. He knew that this generous 3-foot cushion was the heart of his clever plan, a silent, invisible guardian against the coming winter's wrath. It was his masterpiece, built not just with wood and nails, but with smart thinking and a deep understanding of how to make nature work for him. As the last log was placed and the roof completed on his outer shell, Olaf stepped back, a sense of quiet satisfaction warming him more than any fire. He had finished his project just as the bitter heart of winter truly began to settle over Minnesota. Now, the real test would begin. Inside his original log cabin, life continued as usual, but with a remarkable difference. The biting drafts that used to sneak through cracks in the walls were gone. The floor, once always cold to the touch, now held a gentle warmth. It was as if a giant, invisible blanket had been wrapped around his home, a blanket woven from nothing but still air. Olaf would sit by a small fire in the evenings, watching the flames dance, feeling the consistent warmth spread through his cabin. Outside, the wind might howl like a hungry wolf, shaking the branches of the pines and piling snow against the new outer walls. But inside, Olaf barely noticed. The 3-foot air gap did its job perfectly. The cold, fierce wind would hit the outer wall, lose its power, and then struggle to cross the cushion of air. It was like trying to shout across a deep valley. The sound just faded away. Similarly, the precious heat from Olaf's fireplace, which used to escape through the single layer of logs and chinking, was now held prisoner. It would try to push outward, but the air gap would catch it, slowing its escape. The warmth simply bounced around inside the space, making the inner cabin feel cozy and comfortable, even when the temperature outside plunged far below freezing. His neighbors, bundled in layers of wool and fur, would shiver as they chopped more wood, their breath freezing in the air. They would see smoke curling from Olaf's chimney, just like theirs, but they couldn't know the secret. They couldn't feel the steady, even warmth that filled Olaf's home day and night. They didn't realize that while they were constantly feeding their fires, Olaf was using far less wood to keep his cabin at a pleasant temperature. This wasn't just about being a little warmer. It was about a whole new level of comfort and safety in the harsh wilderness. The air gap insulation transformed his cabin from a simple shelter into a true haven, a place where the winter's icy grip could not reach. It was a warm hug from the inside, protecting him from the coldest outside world. Olaf knew his smart design was working, silently proving its worth with every warm, peaceful moment he spent inside his double-shelled home. Beyond just keeping the cold out and the heat in, Olaf's clever design had another important benefit, one that made his daily life much easier. The 3-foot gap between his two house shells wasn't just for air. It also created a perfectly sheltered space around his original cabin. This meant it was an ideal spot to store things, especially his precious firewood. In Minnesota winters, keeping firewood dry was a constant battle. Snow piled up, ice coated everything, and moisture seeped into even the most carefully stacked logs. Damp wood was a nightmare. It was hard to light, it smoked terribly, and it didn't burn with a strong, bright flame. Instead, it just hissed and smoldered, giving off very little heat. His neighbors spent endless hours trying to keep their wood piles covered, often still ending up with soggy fuel. But Olaf had a secret advantage. He stacked his firewood neatly within the 3-foot space, all around the base of his inner cabin. The outer shell, with its sturdy roof, completely protected the wood from snow, sleet, and freezing rain. The air in the gap, kept slightly warmer than the outside air by the inner cabin's warmth, helped to dry the wood even further. So, when Olaf reached for a log to feed his fire, he always pulled out wood that was perfectly dry and ready to burn. It caught fire quickly, crackled cheerfully, and sent strong, clean heat into his cabin. Each piece gave off its full warmth, making his fire more efficient and lasting longer. This meant he didn't need to chop as much wood as his neighbors, nor did he have to worry about frustrating, smoky fires. He would hear his neighbors complaining about their damp wood, about how their fires just wouldn't get hot enough, leaving them shivering despite burning through pile after pile. Olaf, meanwhile, would simply add a few dry logs to his fireplace, watching the flames leap up, feeling the comforting warmth fill his home. This small, yet significant, benefit of his air-gap design meant less work for him, more heat for his family, and a constant, quiet confidence that he was truly prepared for anything the Minnesota winter could throw his way. His firewood wasn't just stored. It was nurtured, ready to bring maximum warmth when it was needed most. The winter of 1889 had been cold, but nothing too out of the ordinary for the folks of northern Minnesota. Olaf's double-shelled cabin had proven its worth, keeping him snug and using less wood. But the true test was yet to come. As the calendar turned to January 1890, a new kind of cold began to creep in, a cold that felt different, heavier, more threatening. One morning, the sky turned an angry, dark gray, and the wind began to wail, not just whistle, but howl with a deep, mournful sound. It wasn't long before the first snowflakes began to fall, not in gentle flurries, but in thick, blinding sheets. This wasn't just a snowstorm. It was a blizzard, a monster of a storm that swallowed the world outside. The wind picked up incredible speed, tearing through the trees, making them groan and creak like old ships. Snow didn't just fall. It swirled horizontally, forming huge drifts against every surface, burying fences and windows alike. The temperature dropped swiftly, plummeting far below zero, making the air so cold it hurt to breathe. Even the strongest men felt a shiver run down their spines, a deep, unsettling cold that promised danger. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face, let alone the path to the barn or the neighbor's house. The world outside became a blurry, white chaos, a roaring symphony of wind and ice. The cold was so intense that water left outside would freeze solid in minutes. Rivers and lakes froze over with thick layers of ice, their surfaces hidden beneath mountains of snow. This wasn't just a storm that would pass in a day. It settled in, relentless and unforgiving, for what felt like an eternity. Farmers worried about their livestock, wondering if their barns could withstand the fierce winds and the crushing weight of the snow. Families huddled closer to their fireplaces, but even there, the cold seemed to find its way in, chilling their bones. This was a catastrophic blizzard, one that would be talked about for generations. It was the kind of storm that tested everything: homes, spirits, and even the strongest beliefs. And in its icy grip, the true value of Olaf's quiet work would finally be revealed, not through words or whispers, but through the simple, undeniable warmth within his unique home. Everything outside was super cold, a frozen world waiting to see who would survive its wrath. As the blizzard raged outside, Olaf's neighbors found themselves in a desperate struggle against the cold. Their sturdy, single-walled log cabins, once thought to be perfectly adequate, were proving no match for the furious assault of wind and ice. The cold air found every tiny crack and crevice, seeping into their homes like a silent, icy enemy. Lars and Helga huddled by their fireplace, wrapped in thick blankets, but even the roaring fire couldn't chase away the deep chill that settled into their bones. The logs they fed into the flames hissed and sputtered. The snow and freezing rain from the days before had soaked into their woodpile, despite their best efforts to cover it. Now, the damp would give off more smoke than heat, filling their cabin with a choking smell instead of comforting warmth. Their fingers and toes felt like blocks of ice, and their breath plumed in front of their faces, even indoors. Children in other homes cried from the cold, their parents trying everything to keep them warm. They stuffed rags into window frames, piled extra blankets on beds, and even brought their farm animals inside for a little extra body heat. But the bitter cold seemed to win every time. Water in buckets froze solid overnight, and frost formed on the inside of their windows, making the glass opaque. Chopping more wood was a terrible task. Stepping outside, even for a few minutes, meant facing the blinding snow and wind that felt like 1,000 tiny needles pricking their skin. The wood they brought in was often heavy with moisture, making their efforts feel endless and pointless. They burned through their fuel much faster than usual, trying to make up for the heat that simply vanished through their thin walls and leaky windows. Sven, Olaf's closest neighbor, paced his small cabin, his face etched with worry. His hands were red and chapped from constantly tending a fire that just wouldn't burn right. He looked at his frozen provisions, his shivering family, and a deep sense of despair began to settle over him. Their houses, which had always been their safe havens, now felt like icy traps. The blizzard was not just a challenge. It was a real threat to their very survival, and they were having a very, very hard time. While the blizzard howled its fury outside, trying to shake the very foundations of every home, Olaf's cabin stood firm, a beacon of calm in the chaos. Inside, the air was warm and still, a stark contrast to the freezing gale outside. Olaf sat by his fireplace, not shivering, but simply enjoying the gentle crackle of dry wood. His clever design was working exactly as he had planned. The 3-foot air gap acted like a fortress wall. The outer shell took the brunt of the wind and snow, stopping much of its icy force. Then the trapped air in the gap created a thick, invisible barrier. It wouldn't let the fierce cold push through to his inner cabin, nor would it allow the precious warmth from his fire to escape. It was a perfect balance, holding the cozy air inside and pushing the bitter cold away. Olaf could walk from one end of his cabin to the other without feeling a cold spot. The floorboards were not icy beneath his feet, and the windows, though covered by the outer shell, didn't have frost creeping along their edges. He didn't need to wear extra layers of clothing indoors. A simple shirt was enough. His kettle steamed gently on the stove, and the aroma of freshly baked bread often filled the air, a luxury his shivering neighbors could only dream of. His firewood, stored safely in the air gap, was always dry. When he added a log to the fire, it burst into bright flames at once, giving off strong, steady heat. He wasn't constantly battling smoky, sputtering wood. This meant he used much less wood than others, saving him trips out into the dangerous storm. He had plenty of fuel to last, even if the blizzard dragged on for weeks. At night, while his neighbors worried about pipes freezing and children catching colds, Olaf slept soundly under a single blanket. The consistent warmth made his cabin feel safe and secure, a true haven from the frozen world outside. He heard the winds roar, but it sounded distant, muffled, like a far-off growl that couldn't touch him. Olaf's cabin wasn't just surviving the blizzard, it was thriving. It was a testament to his smart thinking and hard work, proving that sometimes the simplest ideas, when applied cleverly, could make the biggest difference. His home was a warm, comfortable bubble, a silent triumph against the might of the Minnesota winter. Finally, after what felt like an endless white nightmare, the blizzard began to lose its angry roar. The winds died down, and the heavy snow eased into a gentle fall, then stopped altogether. A silence fell over the land, a deep, ringing quiet that was almost as startling as the storm itself. The world was buried under mountains of snow, but the sky was beginning to clear, promising sunlight. As soon as it was safe to venture out, Olaf's neighbors began digging themselves out, their faces pale and tired. They were exhausted from fighting the cold, their clothes still damp, their hands chapped and raw. Their homes were chilly, their woodpiles mostly gone, and many had suffered frozen pipes or sick children. But then they looked towards Olaf's place. A thin, steady stream of smoke curled from his chimney, not the thick, sputtering kind they had seen from their own. His outer walls, though buried deep in snow, looked strong and untouched. As Sven finally made his way over, wading through the deep drifts, he noticed something surprising. There was no desperate scramble for wood near Olaf's house. No piles of snow-covered, half-frozen logs. When Olaf opened his door, a wave of warmth spilled out, a gentle, inviting heat that made Sven gasp. Olaf himself looked well-rested, his face ruddy and cheerful, not drawn and weary like everyone else's. "Come in, Sven, my friend," Olaf said, a kind smile on his face. "Warm yourself by the fire." Stepping inside, Sven couldn't believe his eyes. The cabin was truly warm, a wonderful, even heat that filled every corner. It wasn't just warm near the fire. it was warm everywhere. And the fire itself was burning brightly, with dry, clean-burning logs, a stark contrast to the spitting, smoking messes in everyone else's fireplaces. Sven looked around, speechless. He saw the tidy stacks of dry firewood stored in the 3-foot gap around the cabin, completely untouched by the storm. He felt the absence of drafts, the consistent comfort. The ridicule, the jokes, the whispers, all of it faded away like melting snow. In the face of such comfort after such hardship, there was no denying it. Olaf's house worked. It didn't just work, it worked wonderfully. The proof was right there, a warm, undeniable truth that settled deep in Sven's cold, weary bones. The warmth inside Olaf's cabin was a powerful teacher. Sven, still thawing by the fire, looked at Olaf with new eyes, eyes that now saw not a quirky neighbor, but a wise man. "Olaf," he began, his voice raspy from the cold. This is truly something. We were all so foolish to mock you." Olaf just nodded gently. He explained to Sven, simply and clearly, about the air gap, how it trapped the cold outside and kept the heat inside, just like a ship's double hull protected against the sea. He showed Sven the dry firewood, stacked neatly and easily accessible in the 3-foot space. He spoke of efficiency, of less wood burned, of more comfort. Word spread quickly through the small community. People, still recovering from the blizzard's brutal grip, began to visit Olaf's cabin. They came, not to joke but to see for themselves. Lars, the burly farmer who had grumbled about wasted timber, stood in Olaf's warm living room, his mouth agape. He felt the even temperature, saw the bright, clean fire, and felt a deep shame for his earlier words. "It's like magic," he whispered, but Olaf corrected him. "No magic, Lars. Just good sense and a bit of shipbuilding wisdom." Young Eric, who had asked if the first house was broken, now listened intently as Olaf explained how the air acted as a blanket. Eric's eyes widened with understanding. It wasn't about making a house bigger. It was about making it smarter. The community, humbled by the storm and awakened by Olaf's example, finally understood. They realized that their traditional ways, while good, could be improved upon. They saw that Olaf hadn't been wasteful at all. He had been incredibly foresight. The idea of air gap insulation wasn't silly anymore. It was a brilliant solution to a very real and dangerous problem. They understood that the space wasn't empty. It was filled with protection. The outer shell wasn't just a second wall. It was a shield. The drywood wasn't just convenient. It was life-saving. They had learned a harsh lesson from the blizzard, but they had also learned a valuable one from Olaf Henriksen. They started to understand that his building method was very smart indeed. With the bitter lessons of the blizzard fresh in their minds, and the memory of Olaf's warm home a beacon of hope, the community underwent a quiet but powerful change. The very next spring, as soon as the ground thawed enough for building, the sounds of hammers and saws once again filled the air, but this time it was different. Sven was the first. With Olaf's kind help and guidance, he began constructing his own outer shell around his existing cabin. He carefully measured out the 3-foot gap, just as Olaf had done, and took extra care to ensure his wood would be dry. Other neighbors, seeing Sven's determined efforts, soon followed suit. Lars, who had once mocked, was now among the most eager. He organized a communal effort, with neighbors helping each other raise the new outer walls, sharing their knowledge and their newfound understanding. "Remember what Olaf said about the air?" someone would call out, as they carefully aligned a log. "It's like a big, quiet blanket." Another would add, "And no more wet wood for me. Not after that last storm." The double shell design, once a strange curiosity, became the new standard. People didn't just add a thin layer. They embraced the full 3-foot air gap, knowing its protective power. They built small doors into their outer walls, just like Olaf's, creating sheltered storage spaces for their firewood, tools, and even extra provisions. Soon, rows of double-shelled cabins began to dot the landscape. They looked a little different, perhaps a bit bigger, but the change was more than just looks. It was a change in how people lived through the harsh Minnesota winters. Children no longer shivered through the nights. Families could gather by their fireplaces, truly warm and comfortable, without constantly feeding damp, smoky logs. The fear of deep freezes and long blizzards lessened, replaced by a sense of security and preparedness. Olaf, the quiet Norwegian immigrant, became a respected figure in the community, a living example of innovation and foresight. He didn't boast or brag, but simply offered advice and shared his knowledge freely. His clever idea, born from shipbuilding and tested by a terrible storm, had truly changed their lives for the better, making their homes stronger and their winters much more bearable. The years that followed the Great Blizzard of 1890 brought a noticeable change to the lives of the people in northern Minnesota. With the widespread adoption of Olaf's double-shell design, their homes were no longer just shelters against the cold. They became true sanctuaries of warmth. The most immediate and cherished benefit was the incredible difference in temperature inside their cabins. No longer did families shiver through long nights, piling every blanket they owned onto their beds. The biting drafts vanished, and the floors lost their icy chill. Even in the deepest parts of winter, children could play comfortably indoors, and adults could relax by the fire without constantly feeling a cold hand creeping up their backs. Their homes felt welcoming, cozy, and safe, turning a harsh environment into a much more livable one. Another huge change was how much firewood they needed. Before, a family might spend countless hours chopping wood, only to burn through it quickly with damp, inefficient fires. Now, with dry wood stored safely in the air gap and the house holding onto its heat so much better, they use far less fuel. This meant less backbreaking work in the freezing cold, more time for other chores or for family, and a smaller strain on their resources. The saved wood could last longer, giving them peace of mind that they wouldn't run out during a long cold snap. Farmers found they could sleep better at night, knowing their homes were secure and their families warm. The worry that used to hang over them each autumn, dreading the coming cold, lessened considerably. They were more prepared, more comfortable, and had more energy for their daily tasks because they weren't constantly fighting the chill. Olaf's simple yet brilliant idea had truly changed the way people lived in this snowy part of the world. It showed everyone that smart thinking could make life much easier and better, even against the toughest challenges of nature. The double-shell homes stood as a testament to Olaf's wisdom, making the long, cold Minnesota winters not just bearable, but genuinely warm and comfortable for everyone.